It was a morning like any other when Thomas first saw her, the wild Mustang, barely clinging to life. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an orange hue over the empty field. He was driving down the old country road, the kind of place where few cars ever passed and even fewer people bothered to stop. But today, something was different. Something in the air made him slow down, and that's when he spotted her. A dark figure, lying motionless on the side of the road, barely visible against the brown grasses. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree, but as he got closer, his eyes locked onto the form of the Mustang, a horse, but unlike any he had seen before. Her coat was matted with dirt, her ribs visible beneath her sunken skin. She was trembling, her eyes barely open, but there was no mistaking it, she was alive. Without hesitation, Thomas pulled over and rushed out of his truck. His boots hit the ground, but his mind was already racing. How had she ended up like this? She couldn't have wandered this far by herself. His heart ached at the thought of a creature so majestic, so wild, reduced to this. Her body seemed broken, but there was something about her eyes, a spark of life that made him believe she wasn't ready to give up yet. He knelt down beside her, his hands shaking as he tried to assess the situation. The Mustang's breathing was shallow, labored, but she was still breathing. Her legs twitched, but she barely seemed to have the strength to lift her head. "Come on, girl. You're not going anywhere yet," Thomas whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure, her or himself. The first thing he noticed was her eyes. There was something about them, wild and untamed, but full of intelligence. They seemed to study him as he crouched there, unsure of what to do next. He felt an overwhelming urge to help, to do anything to save her, but the reality was, he was just a man, alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how to care for a horse. He checked her over quickly, but it was clear, she was in no condition to move. He couldn't just leave her here. What kind of person would he be to walk away from something so helpless? His mind spun with thoughts of what to do. He could try to get help, but there was no phone signal for miles. It would take hours before anyone would get here, and by then, she might be gone. No. If she was going to survive, it would be up to him. He would figure it out. Taking a deep breath, Thomas made a decision. He carefully reached for the Mustang's mane and gently spoke to her, trying to calm her. It was a long shot, but maybe she could sense that he wasn't going to harm her. Maybe, just maybe, he could save her. "I'm not going to leave you," he whispered, more to himself than to the horse. "I'll get you the help you need." But even as the words left his mouth, doubt crept in. How could he possibly save her? She was so far gone. He was no expert. Could he really pull this off? As the Mustang gave a soft whinny in response, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. Something inside him urged him forward, despite the overwhelming odds. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment, he made a promise to her. He wasn't leaving until she was safe. The road ahead was uncertain. He had no plan. No idea how to nurse a dying horse back to health. But one thing was clear, he couldn't walk away. There was something about this Mustang, something that made her worth fighting for. And little did Thomas know, this chance encounter was just the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. Thomas wasn't sure what he was expecting when he pulled up to the Mustang, but it certainly wasn't this. She looked worse up close, her coat matted with dirt and her sides rising and falling with shallow breaths. The skeletal outlines of her body told the painful truth, she was starving, dehydrated, and on the brink of collapse. Yet her eyes held a spark of life that Thomas couldn't ignore. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. With no time to waste, Thomas acted quickly. He reached into his truck's back seat and grabbed the blanket he kept there for emergencies. Gently, he draped it over the Mustang's shivering body, hoping the warmth would bring her some comfort. Her skin was cold, like she had been out in the elements for far too long. Her breathing was shallow, and the faint smell of decay wafted from her. "I'm not leaving you here," Thomas muttered, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't even sure if she could hear him, but he couldn't help it. The words spilled out. He pulled out his phone, but the screen remained blank. No signal. His stomach sank. Without any way to call for help, he knew he was on his own. He had no experience caring for horses. His knowledge of animals was limited to the occasional dog or cat, nothing on the scale of this majestic, yet fragile creature before him. Think. Think, Thomas. There had to be something he could do. He needed to get her up and moving, but her legs seemed weak, trembling beneath her. He made a decision. He would have to try to move her to safety, at least to a spot where he could get her out of the harsh wind. His muscles strained as he gently placed his arms around the Mustang's neck, trying to lift her, but her weight felt like dead weight in his arms. Her body was limp, her legs too weak to hold her own. But then, just as he was about to give up, the Mustang let out a low whinny, her body jerking slightly, as if protesting his efforts. Surprised, Thomas took a step back. She was still there, still fighting. "Good girl," he whispered, reaching out and gently stroking her neck. There was still something in her, something that made her want to fight. His mind raced as he thought back to what he knew about horses. Water. She needed water. Desperately. The nearest stream was a mile away. Too far to carry her, especially in her state. But maybe, just maybe, he could coax her to stand. Taking a deep breath, Thomas moved to her side and began speaking softly. His voice was calm, steady, the only thing he could offer her in this moment of chaos. He needed to build trust, show her that he wasn't a threat. His hands gently stroked her legs, coaxing her muscles to relax, and for the first time, he saw her eyes soften a little. She was listening. After several long minutes, Thomas made another attempt. This time, instead of trying to lift her all at once, he focused on her front legs, helping them rise, one shaky movement at a time. The Mustang's legs trembled, but she allowed it. Her breathing was still ragged, but there was something in her posture, something that told him she wasn't giving up. It was a small victory, but to Thomas, it felt monumental. The Mustang had shown him that she was willing to fight for herself, and that gave him the strength to keep pushing forward. He couldn't afford to fail now. He made a promise to himself and to her, he wouldn't let her down. They had a long road ahead, no matter how uncertain it was, but Thomas knew that if they fought together, they might just make it through. Thomas had spent hours trying to help the Mustang, offering water from a bottle, carefully encouraging her to eat small bits of grass. It wasn't much, but it was something. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this horse than met the eye. She wasn't just a wild animal in need of help, she was something special. But what? The next morning, as Thomas walked to his truck to grab more supplies, he noticed something strange. In the soft light of dawn, he saw the Mustang staring at the ground, pawing at the dirt with one of her front hooves. At first, it seemed like just another anxious gesture, but then Thomas noticed a small, weathered piece of metal half buried in the dirt. Curiosity piqued, he knelt down, brushing away the dirt. What he uncovered shocked him. It was a brand, an old brand, almost faded beyond recognition, but it was there. A symbol, scratched into the metal, shaped like an inverted triangle with a line through the middle. It looked ancient, worn by years of exposure, but there was no mistaking it. It was a brand that had been burned into her skin at some point in her life. Thomas ran his fingers over the edges, feeling the grooves of the mark. He had seen similar brands before on livestock, but never one like this. This wasn't a generic mark from some cattle ranch. No, this was different. He stood up slowly, his mind racing. Was this Mustang part of some sort of lineage? Had she been part of a ranch or some private breeding program? The thought seemed impossible. She was wild. wild, and alone. So how had she ended up in this state? His heart pounded as he remembered the brief glimpse he had of her earlier, the look in her eyes. They had held something deeper. Intelligence. Recognition. As if she wasn't just an ordinary horse, she was part of something more. Thomas knew that the brand wasn't a coincidence. This horse had a past, one that was likely tied to someone, or something, he couldn't yet understand. Feeling a growing sense of urgency, Thomas made the decision to dig deeper. He needed to learn more about the symbol, about her history. Maybe it could explain why she was so close to death, why she was abandoned in this desolate spot. He went to town that afternoon, stopping by the local feed store. There, he ran into an old rancher who had lived in the area for decades. After a brief conversation, the man's face grew serious as he looked at the brand on Thomas's phone screen. "Where did you find this horse?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. "About a mile down the road." "Why?" Thomas replied, unsure of where the conversation was heading. The rancher leaned in closer, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the counter. "That brand, it's from the Anderson Ranch. They were one of the biggest breeders in this region, at least, they were, until the whole operation went under a few years back. Their horses were prized for their speed and intelligence, but something went wrong. There were rumors about shady dealings, animal cruelty, and even some mysterious disappearances." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Could this Mustang be one of the Anderson horses? The implications were staggering. Was she part of that legacy of abuse? Had she escaped from that place? The rancher's voice dropped to a whisper. "Some people say the Anderson Ranch didn't just breed horses. They experimented with them. Made them smarter, stronger, maybe even more than humanly possible." Thomas's mind spun. The Mustang was no ordinary horse, and if she was indeed one of the Anderson horses, the stakes of saving her were much higher than he had thought. But there was one thing he couldn't shake: if she had escaped, why was she so far from her home? And why had she been left in this condition? The answers weren't coming easy, and as the rancher's words hung heavy in the air, Thomas felt the weight of the situation press down on him. He had a responsibility now, not just to save the Mustang's life, but to uncover the truth of who she was, and what dark history she carried with her. The journey ahead was no longer just about survival. It was about redemption, and perhaps, justice. But Thomas knew that getting to the bottom of this mystery could put them both in more danger than he could imagine. As Thomas left the feed store, the weight of the rancher's words echoed in his mind. Experimented with them. The phrase repeated over and over. He had hoped that by saving the Mustang, he was doing something good, noble even. But now, it seemed as though he had stumbled into something much darker. She wasn't just a wild animal in need of care, she was part of something twisted. Back at his truck, Thomas tried to steady his nerves. The Mustang's condition had worsened overnight. She was now unable to stand for longer than a few minutes, her body weak, her muscles atrophied. He had tried to give her more water, but she refused it. No matter how much he coaxed her, she barely seemed to have the strength to lift her head. The questions swirled in his mind. What had happened to her? Why had she been abandoned like this? And more importantly, how was he going to save her if she couldn't even stand? His thoughts were interrupted by a loud noise, a car pulling up behind him. Startled, Thomas turned around to see a truck parked just a few feet away. A man stepped out, wearing a dusty cowboy hat and boots that had seen better days. It was the rancher from earlier. "You're still at it, huh?" the rancher said, his voice rough. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Thomas didn't have time to argue. He stood up quickly, moving toward the Mustang to check on her. She was lying on her side, her breathing shallow. The rancher watched him silently for a few moments before speaking again. "I'm not here to stop you. I just think you need to know what you're dealing with." Thomas turned toward the rancher, his frustration bubbling up. "I know she's in bad shape. But I'm not going to give up on her. I just need to know how to help her." The rancher's face grew darker. "This ain't just about saving a horse. You're dealing with something that shouldn't exist anymore. The Anderson ranch used to breed horses like her for a reason. They weren't just for racing or show, they were experiments. The Andersons were into some strange stuff. They thought they could make horses stronger, faster, more like machines. But they didn't stop there." Thomas stared at him. The word sounded insane, like something out of a dark thriller. But the look on the rancher's face told him this wasn't just a story. It was real. "You're telling me this Mustang was part of some experiment?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The rancher nodded. "That brand on her side? It's not just a mark. It's a symbol of ownership. Of control. The Andersons didn't just breed horses. They were trying to build something they thought was perfect. But you can't play God like that." Eventually, the whole thing fell apart. Animals like her, they weren't made to live in the world the Andersons created. Thomas's stomach twisted. It was starting to make sense, too much sense. The Mustang had been bred to be stronger, faster, maybe even smarter. She was the product of an experiment gone wrong, and somewhere along the way, she had escaped. But why was she in this condition? If she was as special as the rancher made her out to be, how had she ended up starving and alone? Before Thomas could ask more questions, the rancher spoke again. "You think it's bad now? You've only seen the surface. The Mustang's not the only one. There are others like her, out there, running wild. The question is, why did she end up here? Why did she run from the ranch? There's something you don't know, something you need to find out, and you better be prepared for what comes next." Thomas's pulse quickened. He hadn't signed up for a fight like this. All he wanted was to save the Mustang. But now he realized he was involved in something much bigger, a tangled web of secrets, lies, and dangers he couldn't begin to comprehend. The rancher turned to leave, pausing to give Thomas one last piece of advice. "Take care of her," he said quietly. "But don't get too close. There's more at stake here than you think." With that, the rancher climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving Thomas standing in the dust, staring down at the Mustang. The wind blew through the dry grass, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. The stakes had changed. What was once a simple rescue mission was now a tangled mess of questions and uncertainty. And as Thomas knelt down beside the Mustang again, the answers he was searching for seemed as distant as ever. But one thing was clear, he couldn't walk away now. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the field, but Thomas wasn't ready to leave. His thoughts were a swirl of confusion and fear. The rancher's warning echoed in his mind, "Don't get too close. There's more at stake here than you think." But how could he just walk away now? The Mustang, still weak and struggling, was more than just a victim of neglect. She was part of something much darker, something he couldn't yet understand. And he was the only one who had a chance of saving her. He knelt beside her, gently brushing her mane with his fingers. Her breathing was shallow, but there was a flicker of life behind her eyes. He had seen it when she tried to lift her head earlier, and he had seen it in the way she seemed to look at him, as though recognizing him as her only hope. It was a bond that Thomas couldn't ignore. For the first time, he felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. It wasn't just about saving this one horse anymore, it was about protecting something much bigger. He had learned enough to know that the Mustang's survival was tied to a deeper mystery, one he couldn't let go of. But there was something else that gnawed at him, something he had to face. He had no idea how to truly help her. His efforts so far had been futile. She was too weak to stand, too malnourished to recover quickly, and yet every instinct within him told him not to give up. Thomas stood up, pacing around the Mustang, his hands running through his hair. What now? He had a decision to make. Could he continue this fight? Was he ready to risk everything, even his own well-being, for the sake of this horse? And, if he succeeded, what then? Would he be ready to face whatever truth lay buried in the Mustang's past? He looked down at her. She was relying on him. He had no experience with horses, let alone an animal with a background as dangerous and mysterious as hers. But the words of the rancher had stuck with him. You better be prepared for what comes next. The stakes were higher than he had ever anticipated, but Thomas couldn't let fear stop him now. This wasn't just about him anymore. This Mustang had a story to tell, a past to confront, and he would be the one to help her through it. With a renewed sense of purpose, Thomas made his decision. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. He would find a way to get her the medical help she needed. He would learn more about the Anderson Ranch, its dark history, and whatever else was hidden in the shadows. Most importantly, he would keep her safe, no matter the cost. Thomas's resolve solidified as he looked at the Mustang. Her eyes still flickered with that spark of defiance, that glimmer of hope. And for the first time, he understood something. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for justice, for everything the Mustang had suffered, for everything she had lost, and for everything she still had yet to gain. The road ahead wasn't clear, and it wasn't going to be easy. But there was no turning back. He wasn't just fighting for a horse anymore. He was fighting for the truth, and he would make sure it came to light. The next morning, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, Thomas knew he couldn't do this alone. The Mustang was still too weak, and though she had managed to lift her head a few times, the signs of malnutrition and dehydration were severe. His mind raced as he paced in circles around her, trying to figure out his next move. His phone had no signal, and the nearest vet was miles away. But he couldn't afford to wait. Not when she was hanging by such a thin thread. That's when it occurred to him, there was someone he could try. He had heard whispers of a woman named Claire, an old horse trainer who lived on the outskirts of town. Rumor had it that she had worked with the Anderson Ranch years ago, back when they were still operating, and she knew more about horses than anyone in the area. But there was something more to her story, a reason why she had left the ranch. Some said she had been involved in the experiments too, but no one really knew for sure. Thomas had only met her once, a brief encounter at a local event where she had been giving a talk about horse care. Her voice had been strong, but there was a sadness in her eyes that lingered long after the event had ended. Claire didn't live in town anymore. She had retreated to a small cabin, far from the noise and the world, and no one knew much about her recent life. But Thomas couldn't think of anyone else who might be able to help. And if there was a chance she could shed light on the Mustang's mysterious past, he had to take it. He found his way to Claire's cabin later that morning. It was tucked away in a quiet corner of the woods, isolated but peaceful. A small, weathered sign hung on the gate, "The Last Horse," written in bold, faded letters. The irony wasn't lost on him. This was the place where everything could change. He knocked on the door, his heart racing. He hadn't prepared for this conversation. He wasn't even sure what to expect. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 60s, her hair graying but still full and thick. Her weathered face held a serious expression, though her eyes softened as they locked onto Thomas. "I know who you are," she said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "You're the one trying to save that horse, aren't you?" Thomas nodded. "I don't know what I'm doing. She's in bad shape. I need help, Claire." For a moment, she didn't respond. Instead, she studied him, her gaze unwavering. Then, slowly, she stepped aside to let him in. "Come on in," she said quietly. "I suppose it's time to talk." Inside, the cabin was humble, yet cozy. The smell of wood and fresh herbs lingered in the air. Claire led him to a small table in the center of the room, where she had set out a few supplies. "Sit down," she instructed, her tone now gentler. Thomas sat, trying to steady his nerves. He had no idea what Claire knew or how she might react to the Mustang's condition, but he knew one thing for sure: he was running out of time. "I heard about that Mustang of yours," Claire said, her voice calm but filled with an underlying tension. "You're asking the right questions, but some answers aren't easy to come by." Thomas leaned forward. "I don't care how hard it is. I just need to know how to save her. She's not just any horse. I've seen something in her, something different. And I need to know why she's in this condition. I need to understand what happened to her." Claire sighed, sitting down across from him. She looked away for a moment, her eyes clouded with memories. Finally, she spoke, her words slow but deliberate. "She's one of them, isn't she?" she muttered under her breath. "One of Anderson's experiments. I knew it the moment I saw the brand." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "What does that mean? What was the Anderson ranch really doing? What did they do to her?" Claire's expression grew dark, and for the first time, Thomas saw the true weight of her past. The Andersons weren't just breeding horses. They were experimenting with them, trying to create smarter, faster animals. But they weren't just looking for physical traits. They wanted something more. Something beyond what nature intended. She paused, as though weighing her next words. The horses they used for these experiments were more than just animals, they were subjects. Their intelligence was enhanced, but it came at a cost. They were tortured, manipulated, and discarded. They were treated as tools, not living beings. The room felt colder now. Thomas could hardly process the words Claire was saying. These were no longer just rumors. The Mustang, his Mustang, had been part of something horrible, something Thomas couldn't even begin to understand. Claire looked at him, her eyes full of regret. "I left because I couldn't be a part of it anymore. I couldn't watch what they were doing to those poor creatures. But I couldn't stop it, either." Her words struck deep. Thomas sat in stunned silence, trying to process the weight of what he had just heard. The Mustang wasn't just an abandoned animal. She was the product of something deeply twisted. And somehow, she had escaped. Claire stood, walking over to a shelf where she pulled down a small vial of liquid. "This should help her," she said, holding it out to him. "It's a special concoction. It won't cure everything, but it'll give her the strength to fight. It might give you the time you need." As she handed him the vial, Thomas felt a surge of hope. For the first time, he knew that he wasn't alone in this fight. Claire's help would make all the difference. But deep down, he also knew that the Mustang story was far from over. There were more truths to uncover, and much more danger to face. The days passed, and the Mustang's condition began to improve slowly, thanks to Claire's concoction. Thomas had followed her instructions carefully, feeding her the mixture every few hours and making sure she had enough water. She wasn't fully out of danger, but there was a noticeable change. Her breathing had steadied, and her legs were no longer trembling as violently when she tried to stand. She was regaining some strength, but there was still a long way to go. Thomas watched her closely every day, seeing the quiet determination in her eyes as she fought against her weakness. There was something powerful in her, something that told him she wasn't ready to give up. And neither was he. But just as Thomas began to feel a sense of hope, something unexpected happened. One evening, as the sun was dipping below the horizon, the Mustang suddenly stood on shaky legs. For a moment, Thomas thought it was a mistake, that she was about to collapse again, but instead, she took a few cautious steps forward, her gaze fixed ahead. She was moving. His heart skipped a beat. He rushed over to her side, ready to steady her if she faltered, but she didn't. The Mustang's movements were slow but determined. It was as if she knew something he didn't. Her head held high, she continued walking, no longer the fragile creature he had first found, but something more powerful, more confident. It was then that Thomas realized, she wasn't just recovering physically, she was beginning to remember something. Her mind was starting to heal as well, bringing her closer to the animal she had once been, before the torment and experimentation had begun. But as she took another step, Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the trees, followed by a rush of movement. Thomas's eyes darted around, heart pounding. His first thought was that he had imagined it, but as the sound grew louder, he knew it was real. Something, or someone, was coming. The Mustang froze, her eyes wide with sudden recognition. Her muscles tensed, and for a moment, Thomas could see the flash of fear in her eyes. He stepped forward instinctively, wanting to comfort her, but before he could reach her, a figure emerged from the trees. A man, tall and imposing, wearing a weathered cowboy hat and a grim expression. Behind him, several more figures emerged, people, but they didn't look friendly. Thomas's chest tightened. He hadn't expected this. These weren't just locals or curious ranchers, they were here for the Mustang. And judging by the look on their faces, they weren't here to rescue her. The man in front stepped forward, his eyes locked on the Mustang. He didn't even glance at Thomas. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice low and menacing. Thomas stood his ground, his heart racing. "She's not yours to take," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The man sneered. "You don't know what you're messing with. That horse, you have no idea what she's capable of. She's not just some wild animal. She's an experiment. And she belongs to us." Thomas's blood ran cold. The truth had been confirmed. The Mustang wasn't just abandoned, she had escaped from people who wanted to control her, who had used her for their own twisted purposes. But he wasn't about to let them take her now. "I'm not letting you take her," Thomas said, his voice firm. He took a step closer to the Mustang, who had begun to retreat behind him, sensing the danger. The man laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "You really think you can protect her? You don't even know what she is. You're out of your depth, friend. You think you're saving her, but you're only keeping her trapped. She was never meant to be free." Thomas felt the weight of his words. The Mustang had been manipulated, controlled, and bred for something beyond nature. But she wasn't a tool. She was alive, and she deserved to be free. The man and his crew began to move closer, their eyes fixed on the Mustang. Thomas knew the time had come. He wasn't backing down, not now, not after everything they had been through together. The Mustang took a step forward, her body now standing tall, her legs strong, her eyes sharp. It was as if she sensed the danger too. Her posture was no longer one of fear, she was ready. Ready to fight for her freedom. In that moment, Thomas saw the real strength of the Mustang. She wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor. And with that realization, he understood something vital: he couldn't protect her by keeping her hidden. He couldn't fight for her freedom if he wasn't willing to risk everything. The tension in the air was palpable. As the men closed in, the Mustang reared back, her hooves striking the ground with force. Thomas's heart raced as he stepped in front of her, his body a shield, his resolve hardening. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, his voice calm, but his eyes burning with determination. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The man studying him. The Mustang standing tall and proud, her muscles rippling beneath her coat. And then, the standoff broke, the decision made. Thomas was ready to fight for her. He wasn't just protecting a horse. He was protecting a life, a freedom that had been stolen from her. He wasn't about to let anyone take it back. The standoff was electric. The tension between Thomas and the men who had emerged from the trees crackled in the air. The Mustang stood tall behind him, her eyes sharp, her stance unwavering. Thomas could feel the weight of her trust on his shoulders. She had fought so hard to survive, and now, he had to do the same, for her. The man who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, his expression hardening as he sized up Thomas. "You don't get it, do you?" he sneered. "She's not just any wild horse. She's a product of years of work, years of investment. You can't just keep her. She belongs to us." Thomas held his ground, his heart pounding. "She's not a tool. She's a living being. And she deserves a life of freedom." A murmur ran through the men behind the leader, but they remained still, eyes on Thomas. The man with the cowboy hat eyed the Mustang as if weighing his options. There was something unsettling in his gaze, a cold, calculating look that made Thomas feel like he was playing a dangerous game. "Think about it," the man said, his voice shifting into something more persuasive. "You have no idea what she's capable of. You have no idea what she's been trained to do. You can't keep her hidden forever. They'll come looking for her, they always do." Thomas's chest tightened. They? Who was he talking about? And why was it so important that the Mustang be found? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he still couldn't quite understand the full scope of what he was dealing with. But there was no time to ask more questions. The Mustang had already made up her mind. With a sudden movement, she stepped forward, her muscles taut with readiness. Her nostrils flared, and her eyes locked onto the man in front of her. Thomas watched, amazed by the strength she had gained in such a short time. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. In that instant, something inside Thomas shifted. It wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about living, about standing tall in the face of fear, no matter what. He wasn't going to let these men take her back into the darkness. Not after everything they'd been through together. The man with the cowboy hat saw the Mustang's movement, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty flashed in his eyes. He glanced back at his men, who were starting to look uneasy. Thomas could see it, these weren't hardened criminals. They were just men who had been part of something broken, something cruel. But they weren't prepared to face what the Mustang had become. With a deep breath, Thomas spoke again, his voice steady. "You're not taking her. Not today. Not ever." The man's eyes narrowed. He took a step back, then looked at his men, his hand going to his belt as if to signal them. But before he could give any orders, the Mustang moved. With surprising speed, she took a step forward, her hooves striking the ground with a force that sent a tremor through the earth. The men hesitated, looking at each other as if unsure whether to advance or retreat. The Mustang had found her voice in that moment, and it was clear, she wasn't backing down. She wasn't a tool to be controlled anymore. She was a force, a creature of wild spirit, reclaiming her autonomy. The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Thomas stood firm, his gaze unwavering, and for the first time, the men seemed to waver. The man in the cowboy hat glared at Thomas one last time, his lips curled in a tight line. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man warned, but there was less conviction in his voice. Thomas didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. And I'm not letting you take her." With that, the men seemed to realize that there was no point in pushing further. They had come here expecting an easy recovery, but they hadn't counted on the Mustang's strength, or Thomas's refusal to back down. Without another word, they turned and began to walk back toward the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Thomas let out a long breath, the weight lifting off his shoulders as the danger passed. The Mustang stood tall, her body still, but her eyes shining with something new, something victorious. As the men vanished from sight, Thomas stepped forward and placed a hand on the Mustang's neck. "You did it," he whispered, his voice full of awe. "You did it." For the first time since he found her, he felt the full extent of her power. She had fought not just for survival, but for freedom. And in doing so, she had given him a gift, a lesson about resilience, strength, and the power to never give up. But as Thomas looked out over the open field, he knew this wasn't the end. There were still questions to answer. There were still pieces of her past to uncover. And there were still those who would try to reclaim her, to bend her to their will. But for now, the Mustang was free. And that was all that mattered. In the days that followed, Thomas continued to care for the Mustang, but now there was a different kind of peace between them. She had regained much of her strength, walking with a grace that was both wild and regal. Her coat was shining again, her eyes bright and alert. They had made it through the darkest moments together, and now, they were beginning to rebuild. But the journey hadn't just been about the Mustang's survival, it had been about something much deeper. In fighting for her, Thomas had discovered something about himself. He had stepped into a role he never thought he would. He had faced uncertainty, fear, and danger, but he hadn't backed down. And in the process, he had found his purpose, his own strength. He still couldn't forget the words of the rancher and the men who had tried to take her away, "You can't keep her hidden forever." But they were wrong. He wasn't hiding her, he was giving her the life she deserved, one where she could run free, unfettered by the chains of the past. Thomas had spent so much time focusing on what the Mustang needed to survive that he hadn't realized how much the Mustang had given him. She had shown him what it meant to stand firm, to fight for what was right, and to never give up, even when the odds were stacked against you. One evening, as the sky turned purple and the first stars appeared, Thomas stood with the Mustang by the edge of the field. She was grazing quietly, her body relaxed and at ease for the first time in a long while. Thomas watched her, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. For a moment, he thought back to when he first found her, broken and near death. At that point, it had seemed impossible that they could come this far. But here they were, together, free, and stronger than ever. He smiled to himself, the weight of the past few weeks settling into a quiet satisfaction. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, dangers, and people who wanted to control her. But in this moment, he realized something crucial: they didn't need to know all the answers right now. They didn't need to understand everything about her past or why she had been the way she was. What mattered was that they had fought for her future, and that was enough. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the field in a golden glow, the Mustang raised her head and looked at him. For a moment, their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, Thomas understood something profound. She had been given a second chance, just as he had been. And no matter what the world had in store for them, they would face it together. They were no longer victims of circumstance. They were survivors, walking toward a future where they could both be free. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the peaceful landscape, Thomas realized that the Mustang's journey had been his own too. Her strength, her resilience, had inspired him to be more than he ever thought he could be. He gently patted her neck, feeling the warmth of the bond between them. "We did it," he whispered. "We're free." The Mustang nickered softly in response, a sound of contentment. It was as if she understood. And together, they stood there, watching the stars begin to fill the sky, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a way forward, always a chance to rise again. This final chapter reflects the emotional journey that Thomas and the Mustang have undergone, tying together the themes of resilience, freedom, and the deep bond that formed between them. The story ends on a note of hope, leaving the audience with a powerful life lesson: no matter the obstacles or the darkness in the past, there is always the possibility for a brighter future.